So we're joined in Studio 3 by Stacey Thompson, Executive Director of the Livable Streets Alliance, and an old familiar face, Chris Dempsey. Chris is the former Assistant Secretary at MassDOT, one of the founders of No Boston Olympics. That was for this year, I think. Is that correct?
2024, we're finally here.
I was kidding. In any case, he's going to be back in a couple of weeks with one of his colleagues, one of those, what were they called, 10 people on Twitter? Was that what Marty Walsh called you? Exactly. He's now a partner at Spec Dempsey Urban Planning Firm. Great to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. So, Stacey, when I think of bicycles, I always think of you, and we've had really two tragedies involving bicycle accidents. Tell us about what happened and whether there's anything that could have made a difference here.
Yeah, so, every summer we see an uptick in the number of serious crashes involving pedestrians and cyclists, and this summer is no exception. There were two recent, very tragic fatalities in Cambridge where people on bikes were hit and killed by people driving large trucks. These both happened in intersections, and they both involved trucks that do not have side guards. For context, in the state of Massachusetts, state-owned trucks are required to have side guards, equipment on them that prevent a person from being sucked under the vehicle. So while there are certainly intersection improvements that could have also helped with this is a classic case of if we had the same laws that we had in Washington, D.C., this may not have happened because we could regulate all trucks in Massachusetts to have that technology.
But just to be clear, the debate that's going on in Cambridge right now about postponing the implementation of these segregated cycle tracks or segregated bike lanes would have had no impact on this here.
It also could have had an impact.
How so?
Because it's not just about the bike lane. So I think people get really hung up on seeing those segregated bike lanes, but typically you're also designing an intersection when you're designing those bike lanes, and there are a number of ways we could have improved those intersections to increase the sight lines for the person who is driving the vehicle, to protect the person who is in the actual bike. It gets technical and wonky, but there are a multitude of design improvements that could have been required as part of that ordinance.
One last thing before we get Chris Dempsey into this conversation. What are these things called, these guards you're talking about in trucks?
Side guards.
Why are they not mandated on all trucks now?
Because it hasn't been part of Massachusetts law. It's actually, I will give the state credit. The state of Massachusetts requires the vehicles they own to have this technology. There is sometimes
but they could require every private truck to do the same.
And there are parts of the country that do require every truck in the state to have that technology.
Chris, your new firm, in part, is dealing with issues around pedestrian, bike, driver safety, that kind of thing.
That's right.
So what's your take, and do you agree with the take of your buddy Stacey over here?
I absolutely agree with Stacey that the more street infrastructure we have that accommodates both pedestrians and cyclists, the safer we are going to make them. And there's this, this really sad irony, which is that places that are doing a good job of providing bicycle infrastructure are places where more people bike, and that's why we sometimes see the accidents in those places. But it's still much better to be doing this than what we've done for the last 100 years, which is say cars really rule the road and everyone else comes second. We have to be putting vulnerable users like pedestrians and cyclists first. When we do that, not only do we make our streets safer, but we also create more vibrant downtowns. We create more opportunities for local businesses. Our streets become platforms for that economic development rather than just things to drive through.
By the way, Kim Staley from Naples, Florida, and Min T1 are the two women who lost their lives.
Yeah, thank you for naming them.
Were killed in these horrible accidents in Cambridge. So there, as you know, there's a war in Cambridge. I don't want to focus just on Cambridge, but it's sort of emblematic of the stuff we talk about every time you're here, Stacey. Is that people like you and others who are pro-expansion of appropriate infrastructure for cyclists are moving too quickly, and as a result, safety precautions for people like these two women and others are not keeping up with the construction, for lack of a better expression. Is that an unfair criticism?
I don't think that we are moving quickly enough on the infrastructure changes in anywhere in Massachusetts. I think an example that I would point to is right next to Cambridge, the city of Somerville has made a similar commitment to build an even more dense bike network. And I like to point to Somerville because they're very similar to Hoboken, New Jersey. And I bring up Hoboken, New Jersey because they've been able to avoid any serious fatalities for 7 years by moving very, very quickly and implementing a lot of bike infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, not slowing down, using the data to just get the infrastructure on the ground. And the result has been lives saved. They're similarly sized to Somerville, which is why I point to them, because when communities step up and move quickly, again, on this infrastructure that is very, very well proven, I'm sure Chris could point to lots of statistics, it saves lives.
One last thing for you, Chris. But one of the concerns I have is you made a point I hadn't thought about, which was one of the reasons these accidents tend to happen in more bike-friendly communities is because the more bike-friendly you are, the more willing people are to cycle around, obviously, because they feel the opportunity and the safety is there. Rather than depending upon individual communities to do the right thing to protect people so that you're not in a position where I better not cross the border to this next. What are the 1 or 2 or 3 things that Beacon Hill should be doing immediately to provide the safest environment in where there is a bike infrastructure?
Well, let me give you an example of something Beacon Hill has already done that I think should be encouraged and supported more. You've heard probably, Jim, for years about the Chapter 90 program, which is the basic road and bridge funding that we give to every single community in Massachusetts, 351 cities and towns. The problem with that is that there are very few strings attached, and so we aren't requiring that cities and towns upgrade their roads and make them safer when we give them that money. And so MassDOT, for the last decade or so, has tended to keep that program a little bit lower. That doesn't make everybody happy, especially in more rural parts of the state. But instead, they've funded complete streets programs that are grant programs where cities and towns apply and say, we are ready to make these improvements. Will you give us additional funding on top of Chapter 90 to make it happen? And so that was created by the legislature, supported by the last 3 administrations, and we hope will be continued in the future.
So, Chris Dempsey, you've been involved in politics. It seems to me it's not a good idea to have so many headlines involving the Secretary of Transportation in the paper. That's Monica Tibbetts-Nutt. First, she had, which I thought was a good idea, actually, what do I know, that we start paying tolls for people coming from New Hampshire to Massachusetts.
Or at least consider it, right?
Yeah, I kind of thought that was a good idea, but the governor didn't think it was such a great idea. Then we heard that from the Commonwealth Beacon that she was raising questions about the funding of this I-90 Alston turnaround that we've been talking about forever. I think a lot of people thought that it was already okay and funded. And then we heard, this may be the kind of the cherry on the ice cream cone or whatever, that here's this woman who's a longtime advocate for public transit, says she's never been to the commuter rail station, which is 5 minutes from her home, and she calls the train inconvenient and insanely expensive.
But you should ride it.
At a public yeah, and meanwhile she's got a state-funded electric car that's paid for by the state. I don't know, this may be one too many headlines for the transportation secretary. I'm not sure.
Well, full disclosure, I've known Monica for about 15 years, and I have worked in the trenches with her to try to improve transportation in Massachusetts. And sometimes it feels like every step forward we take 2 steps back, but she has been there in that journey along the way, and I have been encouraged to see her step up in the Healy administration, and I do think she is a great person to have in that role. I think she would be the first to admit, if she were here, that those headlines are not great, and that some of the things that she said publicly were a little bit counterproductive to the things that she and the governor are trying to achieve. The governor was very clear, that Monica's specific comments there were not speaking for the administration.
You're talking about the toll thing.
On the tolls, for example. But look, I actually think the fact that she doesn't ride the T and that she does get a vehicle subsidized by MassDOT is really an example of our broader transportation problems and challenges. You've heard me say this line, time and time again, Marjorie, about how since 1991, the gas tax has gone up just 14% and MBTA fares are up 250%. we've made them really expensive for regular people to ride, especially the commuter rail, and we subsidize cars in so many ways.
$378 for a monthly pass.
Yeah, it's a big
that's a
deal.
lot of money.
And so the incentives that we are setting for people, it turns out to be for Monica in particular, but really for the entire Commonwealth, are to drive more and take the T less. And then we sort of scratch our heads and we wonder why we have the worst congestion of any city in the country. It's because of those very same policies.
Chris Dempsey, wait a second. Even though those
Am
statistics...
I letting her off the hook too easy?
I
Jim?
memorized. Those statistics which you gave us years ago are really powerful, particularly during the Baker administration, creating exactly the wrong incentives to get people off the roads. But come on. She's the Secretary of Damn Transportation. Here's Charlie Baker, who was ridiculed. Marjorie, we played this last week. We'll play it again. Charlie was ridiculed. Governor Baker, pardon me, was ridiculed after Marjorie Egan said, "So you've been riding the T lately, Governor Baker?" Here is Governor Baker's response.
I'm not a virtue signaler, I guess is what I would say. I think my job is to try and make the thing better. And given what we inherited on that thing, I'll put our record up against any of our predecessors.
I like Marjorie's "ooh" in the middle of that. That was very powerful. So you seem to be in agreement with Chris Dempsey here about Miss Tibbetts-Nutt 5 minutes from commuter rail. You and I should ride it, but she shouldn't.
Okay, I think 2 or 3 things can be true at once. One thing that has irked me a little bit that I just want to name is that Monica Tibbetts-Nutt is being ripped apart in ways that I have not seen any of her predecessors who have said similarly hyperbolic things previously. And I want to name that. She is the first Black woman in this space. Stephanie Pollack said very similar things when she publicly, and we did not see this kind of
Well,
nitpicking.
with all due respect, we criticized Stephanie Pollack to her face when she was in the studio.
Yes. But what I'm observing happen is sort of this like headline after headline after headline, which I want to pivot to the second thing. If you actually go beyond the headline that is focused on the secretary into the Globe piece, the piece is excellent because what it focuses on is the state's over-reliance on electric vehicles and how we're not meeting our goals, how our grid is still really dirty. And it really gets into the meat of the core of the problem, which is that if we don't invest in solutions that, correct the transportation issues across the state, we're not going to meet our congestion goals. We're not going to get people on public transit. And I think that the secretary is living that in real time.
Okay, let me just say one that you may, I think you're aware of this. When Marjorie criticized Governor Baker, you do know he's a white guy. Do you know that?
Yeah, I mean, I criticized him too.
Okay, fine. But no one here is calling for a resignation or she should be, what I'm saying is talk about tone deaf. If it turns out that you're prescribing for the public that they should do X, maybe you should do X, whether you're Governor Baker or the Secretary of Transportation. No?
I think that we need to be fair.
Okay, you don't want to say that. Okay, fine. We can move on.
I think we can agree that public servants, especially in transportation, should be riding the T as much as possible.
Exactly.
Can we agree on
hold
one
on for one
sorry.
second. You're saying that these are racist attacks on her?
What I am saying is that I have noticed an obsession of nitpicking apart everything the secretary says when I've seen similar stumbles from other secretariats. And I think it's a distraction, right?
We supported the tolling thing too, by the way.
Exactly.
Okay,
so
fine.
what I'd like to focus on is what she's actually talking about, which is we have a funding problem and we have the commuter rail sucks. Like, let's be honest about that, and let's actually talk about those.
One last thing. I think she's got to fix this. I mean, I think she's got to. I think you got to kind of apologize and ride the damn train a few times. I think.
Well,
don't you?
You're speaking to the role of the secretary, which is not just administrative; it is political, right?
Yeah. Of course,
it's inherently a political job. And I think you're probably going to see her out there on the T. I think you're going to see the governor on the T more, and I think that's for the better.
Okay, so I have another complaint, and then we'll get. Well, I have a complaint about everything. So the next one is this. I'm reading the story about this Green Line crash prevention thing, where Phil Lang, the relatively new GM, is getting credit for canceling the contract with this do-nothing entity that got $18 million already, which he says we're going to try to recoup. I don't want to talk about crash prevention unless you two guys are dying to do it. I want to talk about responsibility and accountability. We talked to Ang, Governor Healy, and others about why is nobody upset with the guy who is named in the Globe story who knew that the tracks were the wrong size on the Green Line extension, and everybody says, let's fix them. Well, how about fixing them and going after the guy who knew about it.
Yeah.
Same thing in this story. Why is the person who approved an $18 million payment to a crash prevention vendor who has apparently no interest in providing crash prevention services? It seems to me, I'm almost done this monologue. I'll start with you, Chris. It seems to me that, actually we start with you every time. I'll start with you, Stacey. It seems to me that if you don't hold people responsible for bad behavior in the past, it is at minimum not a disincentive for bad behavior in the future. So why isn't there an effort to hold these people accountable?
You know, my guess is that these were decisions made by the previous administration and that they usually involve dozens of people who, you know, the person who hired him has probably left. They're probably 3 people ago. That is, just to answer your question in a straightforward way, that's probably why we're not seeing them come down hard on this specific individual. Having said that, this is this administration's duty to tell us how they are going to do things differently so that the contractors they are hiring now, the people they are hiring now are going to be set up for success. And, you know, we've seen a little bit of this, but I have not seen the level of transparency that I would like around this, around the automated fare collection contract, around other contracts that are ongoing where we haven't seen a very public course correction from this administration yet.
This is a relatively small contract as it relates to the MBTA, under $100 million. The AFC, which is the fare collection contract, is a $900 million contract.
What's the problem with that?
Well, I mean, we don't have enough time in today's program to go through the issues.
Give us the highlights, the cliff notes or lowlights.
When that was first commissioned by the T in 2018, it was supposed to be up and running by 2021. It's now 2024 and it's still not running. So that's just one example of how far behind it is. You've got the orange and red line cars, of course. The administration has made some progress on those, but those are still delayed. Those were supposed to be all up and running as of today. Red line cars, they're not there yet. Just a handful are. And that's $1 billion contract. So I think this is a good sign.
Didn't we give them money? We discussed this with General Manager Ang. We gave them more money, even though they failed in their
try to get it done.
To try to get it done. Well, that's a hell of an incentive to do the right thing.
We're
talking to Stacey Thompson and Chris Dempsey about transportation issues.
We always talk about Phil Ang, Ted Lasso of the MBTA and how cheerful he is and all that kind of stuff.
That's what they call him internally. We didn't make that up.
No, we didn't make that up. But the poor T, I felt kind of bad reading this Taylor Dolvin story about how they went to the legislature, were talking about all the things that they could do to fix their $700 million operations funding gap, and no one seems to be interested in filling their $700 million operations funding gap. So what do they do?
I mean, they should put Chris and I in charge. We would fix it overnight. I think that's the answer. But short of that solution, this is not surprising. We're at the end of the formal session for the legislature. They're focused on getting the budget done, getting a few bills out of the way. I think everyone, the legislature and the governor, is punting to early 2025. That this is a big, uncomfortable conversation that we are going to be forced to have. From what I know, it's still happening behind the scenes, right? And I think we've seen a lot of good coverage from Taylor around this. There are no surprises about how much money we need or what the policy solutions are. It's about having the political will to put the package together. And some of the pieces of that package are probably going to be uncomfortable or controversial.
I mean, these seems like legit needs that the T has.
Well, the number is $25 billion, right, for the deferred maintenance. And that, again, let's talk about scale here. So you're laughing, Marjorie.
No wonder the secretary is not riding on the commuter rail. But go ahead.
So it's $25 billion. It's a big, big number. But I was just in Seattle this last weekend. They're spending $50 billion to build their light rail system in the hopes that it will carry as many riders as the Green Line does already in Boston today.
Wow.
So that gives you a sense of how valuable the MBTA is as an asset to our region, that other regions are trying to duplicate just a portion of our system and spending $50 billion. All of a sudden, 25 doesn't feel like such a big number anymore. This is going to come down to the work of the Transportation Task Force that the governor has convened and that Stacey just referenced. They have till the end of the year to come up with these recommendations, and then I think the legislature will deal with it next year. Having been through these battles before, I am not overly optimistic about fixing this problem in one chunk, but I think that's okay. I think we got to take what we can bite off at the time, get through that, and then fight the next battle.
Well, you know, I hate to be optimistic here because we haven't been, Marjorie. So let me say, you say they'll take it up next year. The fact that they'll be refreshed from their 5-month vacation is really a positive
Maybe
sign.
they will visit other cities that have better
I'm sure
transit
they'll be doing
systems
that.
and
In their
be
bathing
inspired.
suits, probably. So one last thing. I was off, but Seth Moulton was here the other day, who's a big train guy. And we're big train people, Marjorie and I, especially high-speed rail. He was doing something in Dallas. He's a big champion, along with an odd twosome, Governors Weld and Dukakis, for North-South rail. Here's a little bit of what Congressman Moulton had to say about North-South rail to Marjorie and Andrea Cabral on Friday, I think it was.
I mean, this is just like inconceivable to people from Boston, and yet this is totally natural all over the rest of the world. We're just used to, well, you either live in the South and you can only go to South Station, or you live in the North and you can only go to North Station, and that's it. I mean, you can't even take a train from New York to Maine, even though Amtrak serves both destinations, because New York trains stop in Boston because they can't go 1 mile under the city and then start again to go to Maine. So this would be totally transformative for living and working around Boston.
And then another guy who I have a lot of respect for, the retiring House Chair of the Transportation Committee, Bill Strauss, writes, is it in Commonwealth Beacon?
I think it's the Globe today.
The Globe, I'm sorry. In the Globe, he writes an op-ed saying, horrible idea. Who's right here?
The answer is it's complicated.
Okay.
What I would actually point back to, which I've referenced before, is I believe now the Peabody Award-winning Big Dig podcast produced by
Ian
GBH.
Coss,
It's a great
and
podcast.
Great program.
Yeah.
But it comes back to, is this possible? Yes. Is it complicated and expensive? Also yes. And what are the long-term benefits of having a vision? So is the north-south connection the right answer? I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I do think at this moment the congressman is pointing to a need to have a real vision and a willingness to invest in big projects like this. Otherwise, we're not going to be where we need to in 20 or 30 years.
So
from
are
now.
you the right person to answer the question? Because she said she wasn't.
I'm going to give you this answer, Jim, which is
Okay.
not a definitive yes or no, but I would advise the supporters of the North-South Rail Link to try to boil it down to some tangible next steps rather than just promising that this one project is going to solve all of our transportation
What does that
problems
mean?
in
Like
the region.
what?
Well, so here's an example. If you're going to build the North-South Rail Link, you're doing it in a tunnel. And if you're going to do it in a tunnel, you cannot run diesel trains in that tunnel. You have to electrify the trains. So you're talking about electrifying essentially the entire MBTA system. That in and of itself, when I say system, the commuter rail system, that in and of itself is a multi-billion-dollar task. And so if I'm them, strategically, I would say, let's start by electrifying some of the lines. And let's show the benefits to the environment, to environmental justice communities, and to riders in the form of better service, faster service from electrification. Prove that that investment is worth it, and then we can have a conversation about the tunnel being worth it as well.
You know, by the way, if you hadn't screwed up the Olympics, all that would have happened
would have
already.
been
You know
fixed.
that already?
We'd be riding
Isn't that what they were
unicorns and
promising?
magic
Right,
carpets.
exactly.
But just one thing where the congressman had me swooning was when he showed me the diagrams. They were in the paper.
I wasn't here for that.
Well, you see North Station and then you see South Station. They're a mile apart.
Yeah.
And it does seem kind of insane that all the trains in one direction stop at North Station. That's the end of that. I guess you can get out and walk if you're able, or you take an Uber or something. And then there's South Station down here, as opposed to the line through. I mean, that seemed pretty compelling to me.
Look, I think, again, when we're talking about a project this big or something like the I-90 project that is also in the billions of dollars, I think the real problem in Massachusetts is that if you ask anyone in the administration today, what is your vision for transportation? What does it need to look like? What kind of service do we need to run in 10 or 20 years? They can't answer that question. And so we don't know if it's worth spending $8 billion on that project until we know what we need.
Two very quick questions, 30 seconds each before you go. You cycled here today.
I did.
Are you nervous these days? I mean, you're a huge cycling advocate, we know, and a pretty powerful advocate, I should say, too. Are you nervous these days?
I am not more or less nervous than when I normally bike. I bike slowly. I probably drive you crazy if you're driving behind me because I'm going 10 miles an hour. What I would say is I have noticed an intense uptick in poor driver behavior. And I know that people driving are thinking, I've seen cyclists doing bad things too, but I was almost hit by 2 cars on my way here today, and it's a 25-minute bike ride.
And those
Oh.
things are not.
Nervous.
Let's be clear. Those things are not the same.
No.
If you are a cyclist or pedestrian and you make a bad choice, you're putting yourself at risk. If you're a driver
Yeah.
and you make a bad choice, you're putting other people at risk. We cannot equate those things morally or legally in this society.
Well, you used up 15 or 30 seconds. What's this new firm of yours doing?
So we're Spec Dempsey, based off of my work and the work of Jeff Speck, who's the author of Walkable City, which is the best-selling urban planning book of this century.
Ooh.
And we've teamed up to bring walkable neighborhoods and places, not just to Greater Boston, but all around the world. We're working in Texas and Tennessee and Indiana, and we're hoping to work in other countries soon. So it's a lot of fun to be working on it, and I'm having a blast.
Hold on,
Great.
one last thing.
Yeah.
How happy should we be that the Olympics are not coming here?
Well, no,
in
he's
just
coming back to do that. Let's not give it
Oh,
away.
he's coming back to do
He
that.
is coming
I
back
did not
with
know
one
that.
of his fellow
Okay.
10 people on Twitter
Forget that.
to discuss that. Is that fair enough?
I'm really glad they're not coming here, let me tell you.
It's two
Really
of us.
glad.
I think that's
Especially
four of
with what
us.
they're doing
Four
in
of
the
us.
river,
What?
in the Seine. How do you say
In
it? Seine?
crapping in the Seine?
Yeah, thank you,
They
Jim.
are. That's other protest.
That's the French word
Yeah.
It's
for
my
it.
kind of protest. No, it's not actually. That's not.
Oh, yeah.
Good to see you both.
Stacey
Take care.
Thompson is
Thank you.
Executive Director of the Livable Streets Alliance. Chris Dempsey is the former Assistant Secretary of MassDOT, one of the founders of the No Boston Olympics, and now a partner at Spec Dempsey. Thank you both for coming in.